Okay, welcome to Political Ideas. Last week we began talking about Plato, and Plato is really the founder of political philosophy. There were a couple of other people that Aristotle mentions who were also interested to try and envisage what the best kind of state was, and we're talking city-states, as you remember. But really, Plato's importance is not only that he's the first political philosopher, but his innovations in philosophy, because philosophy had preceded him by a few generations, but the innovations he makes in philosophy really make the difference between what's often called pre-Socratic and post-Socratic philosophy. And it's really philosophy proper, we can say, begins with Socrates stroke Plato, and as you'll recall, Socrates doesn't write a word. Anything we know about Socrates either comes from Aristophanes, who doesn't like him and criticizes him and mocks him, Xenophon, who really loves Socrates but was not that philosophical, and Plato, who takes Socrates' ideas and you could say builds a kind of system with them. There is some dispute amongst Plato scholars how systematic it is, but we'll move on from there. So you will also recall that what we were looking at last week, oh good, come on in, Cassie, I've just started. What we were looking at last week, by the end of the lecture, we were looking at Plato's Socrates in the search for the nature of justice, makes the claim that it's better to understand what justice is if we move from the micro to the macro. And in the micro to the macro, we move from the soul to the city-state. Ultimately, though, it will be Socrates in his way, as the leading character in the dialogue, trying to instruct the souls of his listeners. And as you also will remember, I mentioned that Glaucon is the last man standing. For about the last half of the book, no one else ever says a word. It's just him and Socrates. Where they've gone, God knows. Have they fallen asleep? We also recall that basically a tripartite kind of state had been set up, which in Plato is meant to be an analogue with what he considers to be the tripartite nature of the soul. The irrational part, what he calls the spirited part, or timos, and the rational part. Now, this distinction of the human psyche between the rational and the irrational has a very strong and enduring pedigree. And Plato has really kicked this off. I think it's a really troublesome distinction. I don't think it's all that helpful. One of the things it does, and really what Platonic philosophy does, he cements a view of us as capable of being purely rational creatures. I'm very skeptical of that. But later in the semester, we'll look at some other thinkers that are also very skeptical of that. That's up to you what you think on this. I'm just signaling this to you. So what he had envisaged, or what he argues for in the Republic, that the reasoning part of the soul is ultimately represented by the philosophers, who become the philosophers' king. So the best kind of rulership, the one in which the irrational part of human beings and the more irrational people within a regime are managed by a group he calls the guardians. They correspond to that bit of spiritedness, the timos, as I mentioned before. They require courage, they require a certain amount of intelligence, and the essential feature that they have about them is they are drawn to supporting the more rational part of the soul, that is the philosophical enterprise. And again, I think I mentioned that what Plato is ultimately trying to do is draw over his listeners into appreciating the importance and the value of the philosophical life, because Plato knows Socrates had been executed. I mentioned this last week, and this for Plato was a symptom of the fact that there was something really remiss in Athens, that it was degenerate in some important ways. They had killed the best person. So he's really making a case for why philosophy should not be persecuted. That's in general, and Socrates in particular being executed. This is in a sense Socrates coming back from the dead. Actually, in the Apology, which is the trial of Socrates, there's a part within that where Socrates says to his accusers, well, you think you'll get rid of me. I'm telling you, if you find me guilty and you execute me, or banish me, it doesn't really matter. They did execute him. He had plenty of chance to escape, by the way. That was a very conscious decision on his part to go along with the law. And the Athenians found themselves in the position of, oh, God, I really wish we hadn't done this, but we've got to go ahead with this. What was I going to say? Yes, Socrates says to his accusers, you do this, you will make a martyr of me. And this will really cement the place of philosophy. You will be aiding and abetting philosophy. So philosophy is a new kind of practice. And as we'll see now, I've touched on it, but I'll go back to it, that ultimately it is an attempt to gain pedagogical hegemony. That is leadership over what should be taught to the citizens, what should be taught to people generally, to their kids, you know, obviously not the slaves, or women. I also mentioned this, the role of women in Athenian society, but ultimately how they can be better educated. And when we look at Aristotle, we'll see how important it is to educate the citizens aright. And in part, that's because the philosophers believe that the other aspirants for pedagogical hegemony, that they all suffer from some fundamental deficiency in their method. So, and I'll talk now in a moment, and I'll talk now about his critique of the poets. Now, I did touch on this again last week, but I'm repeating myself. Ancient Greek consciousness, the uniqueness of it, unlike the people, the biblical people, the Jews, at this stage, contemporaries with them in another part of the world, or people from elsewhere, no one really, though there's a bit of influence of poets in China, but nowhere near on the same scale as they are in Greece. To put it bluntly, when people in Athens would go into the assembly, and the assembly serves as both a kind of large courtroom and a political forum, hence, because of the very nature of the location or the place, the site of political decision making, and the way in which political decisions are made, that is with the assent or dissent of the people all sitting there in this great big forum, eloquence, rhetoric, the use of language was all important. This is why oratory is also a major means of gaining political power. So you might recall me saying the hegemons that Plato is directing his critique at are the poets, the orators, the sophists who taught basically all these tricks. I did go into that last week, and the statesmen more generally. So you could see why he's going to have a list of enemies, because basically people have an important skin in the game, important stakeholders in gaining political power and exercising that power. Plato is trying to turn people against them, as did Socrates. They're trying to turn people against that group. Now, the poets, I'll just retreat. It was typical in the assembly that when someone wanted to make a point, they would cite a poet. And there were a number of poets that had high prestige. The greatest of them, who is the first of them, who by now has been dead now a few hundred years, quite a few hundred years, is Homer. And his two books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are akin to being a kind of Bible for the Greeks. It provides orientation. Why? Because everyone learns their stories. You had these people called rhapsodes, and there is a little dialogue called the Ion by Plato, which is a dialogue about a rhapsode. That's someone who comes and sings Homer. And that's how it would be listened to. People would sit back at parties or wherever in some kind of forum, and someone who had recited this, and if you've ever read the Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, which I strongly recommend you do, and Robert Fagles' translation is just beautiful. There's some other good translation, but that's particularly beautiful. You see how musical it is, and you see how beguiling it is. It's so fantastic, and it's dealing with very important themes: love and war, a homecoming, all sorts of aspects of which relate to what the Greeks call, and what Plato will use the term arete, virtue. Virtue meaning excellence, quality, the quality of excellence. Now, we hear that word excellence all over the place in managerial speak, and it makes me want to throw up. And I recall in the 1970s when I first started to see this word being widely used outside of the Platonic corpus, because it would almost never appear anywhere outside the writings of Plato or Aristotle. It was a very Greek term. Excellence being the translation for arete, also often translated as virtue. It simply means fulfillment of the capacity. The fulfillment of the capacity. So when the Greeks listened to Homer, they heard the stories about the gods and the heroes. That is, they heard the stories about the highest powers and the best of men. And this would provide them with a kind of model. And again, I'll come back a step and say the word model, from which we now widely use the word role model. You're doing education, some of you, and you know that term is constantly bandied about in philosophy of education. That term didn't really gain a lot of traction in the West, and it just off until the 1970s. Again, then you went from no one talking about role model to everyone talking about role model, and teachers thinking it's their job to identify who the role models are and tell you and be a role model, which now we take it just some scandal just happened in the NRL, the rugby league, just the other day. They're not being role models. They're going to be stood down, these couple of rugby players, because of their misbehavior. So that's a very interesting, I think, indication of the way in which narratives generate a form of modeling on how we behave. So Plato really picks this up. He's really picking this up. He's picked up that this is what the poets are doing. I started with Homer. I'll briefly mention the second one that's most important would be Hesiod. Hesiod's work is very different to Homer's. Homer's work is, as I said, there's two big stories, one about the Trojan War and one about Odysseus coming home from the Trojan War, the fidelity of his wife who's waiting for him, and the misbehavior of these other suitors of Penelope, that is, other people around his farm who want to get possession of his property by marrying her, and then at the end he slaughters them all. That's really the story. And we see all the trials and tribulations that Odysseus does to come home. It's just great. Hesiod's work is nothing like that. Hesiod is remembered for two primary works. One of them is a story about the nature of the gods, or rather the birth of the gods and the pandemonium of the internal struggle which ultimately establishes Zeus as the highest god, Zeus being the sky god. The sky god overlooks reality, got the eye to see reality. Zeus is also the god of lightning. If we go back to Homer and we look at Zeus, we see that the thing about Zeus is he's the strongest of the gods. This is suggesting that the god of heaven, who can see, is the strongest of the gods. Unlike Homer, and you wouldn't really get this from Plato's critique. I think Plato's extremely unfair to Hesiod when he starts criticizing the poets, and I'll talk in more depth about that, as I said. But Hesiod is really searching for some moral anchor for Greek society, which is moral in a different sense to Homer. Homer is looking for the virtues in sense of prowess bound up with power, ability, capacity. And the two greatest heroes in Homer's work are Achilles, who's the strongest but loses his way out of jealousy and goes into a rage and nearly is responsible for the Greeks almost losing, and then he comes back into the battle. He's raw strength, raw power. And the other one is Odysseus. Do you know anything about Odysseus in the Trojan War? You remember Odysseus is the one that comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse, he builds this, he gets the Greeks to build this great wooden horse, leave it outside of the fronts of the gates of Troy. The Trojans think, what the hell is this? They bring it in, and all the Greeks are inside waiting to slaughter them when they go to sleep. So what's that telling us? Well, Homer in his poems always have epithets, little sayings that he attaches to the name of his hero whenever he discusses them, and the gods as well. Far-seeing Zeus and so on. In the epithet for Odysseus is nimble-witted, the man of nimble wits. And when you read the Odyssey, it's very much a search for the truth. Odysseus' son comes looking for him. He needs to find the truth of things. In fact, the central thematics of the Odyssey, apart from the homecoming and the slaughter, is the veiling and unveiling of truth, the use of disguise, the use of, and the circumstance of simply not knowing and trying to find out the truth of things. Even when I say that, I think you hopefully can see that therefore there is a kind of lineage between poetry and philosophy. Without the poetic culture that had preceded philosophical culture, I think there's a very strong argument, and there's lots more that I could go into about this, which illustrates that there's actually a connection between the two. But Plato wants to sever that connection because he thinks poetry goes astray. Now, I was talking about Hesiod, and I said he describes how Zeus emerges from power. But what comes out of that emergence, and it is a bloodbath. It's basically pandemonium and a bloodbath. Now, that is a very good insight into something. Primarily this. Polytheistic society suffers from a fate that the gods can be in pandemonium. And although there's a kind of romantic review, especially a lot of it happening in the 20th century, there's a kind of romantic revival of the idea of paganism and polytheism, thinking in some way that it is ultimately more moral or more just or fair or basically more respectful of groups to each other. Hesiod indicates that that's by no means the case. He indicates that what we need is one god to preside over the other gods. In this respect, there's a certain analogy to what the inventiveness and perspective of the Israelites, because it was the Israelites that had escaped from the polytheism of Egypt and then come up with the idea that there's one all-knowing, all-seeing God. Well, actually, that's a little bit too much in the case of the biblical God, because the biblical God, unlike what we'll see with the philosophical God, because what we're going to see with Plato and then Aristotle is there's a movement towards a kind of monotheism. And this has led people to see that there's certain affinities between the Israelis and the Greeks, or the Israelites and the Greeks. There's a kind of truth in that, but ultimately, as we will see, the philosophical God is really all-seeing, all-knowing, and in this respect, it's building upon stuff that Hesiod has already said, and other philosophers that precede Plato, one in particular is Xenophanes, who is also looking for one God that isn't anthropomorphic in any way, shape, or form. And by anthropomorphic, I mean human-like, in human form, and the Homeric gods are all human-like in human form. It's still that way in Hesiod, but as we can see, because he becomes a moral god, lays down, basically is able to look into the hearts of men and lays down what is just, what is not just, and punishes those who are unjust. We can see that as a movement in a monotheistic direction. But you will recall from what you may know about the Bible, or you may know this much, God of the biblical God creates the world, he speaks it into existence, and then he sees what is done. command, then sight. The philosophical consciousness is sight before command, which raises the question, which is going to be very important when we get to the Christian tradition, because the Christian tradition in some ways brings in the Greeks, but it's very much built around the Jewish experience, because Christianity begins as a Jewish revolt. It brings in the question of how much can we know? And ultimately, the philosophical quest is that knowledge will disclose truth. The Israelites, on the other hand, have far more in common with many ancient peoples in this one respect, even if they're monotheistic and the others generally are polytheistic. There's a brief moment in Egypt where there's a kind of monotheism, but we won't go into that. What they see is that there's just too much to know. It's like we got the brains of peace. So the righteous will be the person that responds to the command. So it's a command culture, but a divine command culture. But as I said, the God is changing his mind as he moves along, as he sees things. After the flood, he said, never again will I do that. The covenant is then made. You know, so we see this kind of movement, which from the Greek philosophical point of view, also another example of this, which I'll touch on in a moment, is the Israelite God Yahweh gets very angry. He's capable of wrath. From the Greek philosophical point of view, from Plato's point of view, who creates a theology, and the first time, you know what the word theology means, study of the God, study of the logos is the word, the reason, the study of. Theos is the God, the study of the God. Plato is trying to understand God, the God, through the use of reason, that is, by drawing upon that rational part of the soul, which is going to be where the divinity is. And in fact, the divinity is reason writ large, we could say, in Plato, which means that the Israelite God, in terms of his behavior, would be seen as definitely deficient. I'll bring up some other aspects of what the nature of the gods are in Plato. Now, the other, I will just mention, going back to the poets for a moment, so I've just said Hesiod is already moving in that monotheistic direction. Now, you recall also me mentioning last week that as they were looking into the concept of justice before they reached that, a number of poets had been cited along the way, because again, using the poets is what one did to garner political credibility, improve one's narrative, and basically have insights into the real, because the poets had been visited by the muse. Homer begins both the Iliad and the Odyssey with the phrase, "Sing to me, O muse." So does Hesiod. He asked the muses to come and speak to him. Oh, one other thing I should have mentioned about Hesiod, which reinforces the importance of morality in his way of thinking about things, is his other main book is a little book called Works and Days, which is basically kind of homespun philosophy about how to behave. And that's, again, that was seen as very important by the Greeks. The other poets I'll just briefly mention in passing, there were lyric poets, Sappho, great female lesbian poet. She lived on the islet of Lesbos. She loved women as well as men. Archilochus. And then there were the tragic poets, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides. They are the main ones. But they also had a great deal of prestige, and their work is fantastic. In the other course, which I'm making available online, I'm not actually doing the lectures this year, but they uploaded last year's lectures. I go into some detail about those. So Plato, basically in setting up the program of what it is that makes a philosopher, says, first of all, you guys are hearing too many stories, and these stories mislead you. And these stories come from the poets, and the poets do two major wrong things. As it turns out, it'll be those two major wrong things come from another thing. He argues they don't have a method to get to the truth. They lack a method. I'll get to the issue of method later. And what Plato does is his criticisms in books 2 and 3 of the Republic, and then in books 10, there's 10 books in the Republic, he comes back to the poet. So having given him a good pasting, he then returns to them and then carries on. He wants to leave a knockout punch against the poets. So he says the two things they do is they misrepresent the gods and they misrepresent the heroes. Now, in doing this, Plato is basically doing two things. He is redefining the nature of what makes a hero, and he redefines the nature of what makes a god. Let's start with the heroes. There's a little bit in the Apology at the trial of Socrates where Socrates says, okay, you guys think that Achilles is a great hero, but I am really like Achilles. He equates himself with Achilles. Now, no Greek present in that trial would have done anything other than got crazy over that, even though one of the things that is pointed out is Socrates was supposed to be a very good warrior. So you can see that nowadays we wouldn't expect that, we wouldn't ask of our philosophers that they could also fight. But back for the Greeks, that was an important consideration. Not that we know whether or not Plato could really fight. Maybe by then it's gone, but Plato is basically bolstering Socrates. So he's suggesting he's spirited, he's courageous, he is the best, he is as good as Achilles. But he's also got this other dimension that Achilles doesn't have, and Achilles is prone, in fact, was governed by rage. And the whole book of the Iliad is a book about the rage of Achilles, the damage that does, and ultimately how it provides a spur to action when it's directed in the right way. Now, what Plato then does is he goes through a whole list of references that you can find in Hesiod and in the tragic poets and in some lyric poets, and he sees all these behaviors of heroes which basically make them very excitable. There's a great Warren Zevon song, one of my favorite artists, called Excitable Boy. It reminds me of what Plato's doing. They're too excitable. They're wailing, they're crying, they're getting angry. This is no way to behave. You need equanimity. You need what he calls temperance. And that concept will be very important in both Plato and Aristotle. You need to balance the passions. These heroes are too driven by passion. And in doing that, they can't see straight. They can't see clearly. So they're caught up in things. So the reason why the new hero is going to be Socrates, from Plato's point of view, is that Socrates is calm in the midst of storm. And he wants the listeners or the readers of the book The Republic, and in the ideal city Plato is building up, or Socrates is building up, he wants his ideal citizens to be philosophically instructed rather than poetically instructed, so that they will then gain the characteristics, the virtues of the great Socrates. But they will be calm, reflective, thoughtful, reasonable, unlike those crybaby, loudmouths, braggarts, etc., etc. That is all the other people that the Greeks have thought of as heroes. So that must be wise, they must be just, they must be courageous, etc. So it's all basically the qualities that are now foisted onto the heroes are the qualities that philosophy itself sees as virtue. Now we come to the gods. Oh. Sorry? Oh, thank you. Okay. Hello. I don't know if even people. Oh, yes, you can. You can see. I can see myself there. Okay. Not that it's great for anything. Look at the slide rather than me. So we've got the gods. Now, remember this. This is really important. All societies require orientation. All societies. We, as a society, require orientation. What took place in the French Revolution and subsequently developed through the 19th through the 20th century is that the gods were displaced as the primary, or God in Western society was displaced as a primary source of orientation, because that was an inner kind of orientation. This is what happened in the West. It goes back to the Reformation, but it's really cemented and sealed when the state itself, and essentially the most philosophically literate, the ideas brokers, now we have ideas brokers who I don't think are very philosophical literate, provide orientation. And this is precisely what we're seeing in our society today. It's not that the same need for human orientation has gone, because every society must move into its future and directs its future and is directed by the aspirations and hopes that will make the future, and it then reviews the past upon that basis. Every society does this. Only the difference was, in pre-philosophical society, it was the figures of the gods that were the primary directors. Now, where there is no public, universal, in the West, universal higher authority anymore, no publicly acceptable universally higher authority, we're ultimately left to people that are making claims and arguments about the nature of how we should be. Which is why, for example, the narratives around public morality, around speech, are so vitriolic, are so divisive today, because there's not really much of a consensus. But certainly those people that believe that there should be a consensus argue vigorously for there being these ideas which we must all take seriously. Part of the problem, though, part of the problem we find ourselves with in modernity is the Greeks had rituals, public sacrifices. We recall even Socrates participates in that, even if he's introduced a strange new god, as the accusers said. We no longer talk the language of the gods except privately, or in our religious area, which might be hived off from the rest of the life that ostensibly matters. This is a massive cultural change, and the problem with ideas are they're threadbare. They're much more threadbare than the gods, because even though, by the way, I'll say it just generally, if I use the word religious, and this in a sense, religion is a bad kind of word, and I'll tell you why it's a bad kind of word, because that suggests there's the religious component of life and there's other component of life. Whereas in mythic societies, life is not compartmentalized like this. And in more traditional societies, pre-enlightened societies, and I'll talk about this much later, life is just not broken down in this way. So this I'll come back to. So getting the gods right, you can see, is going to be this really important issue. Now, what Plato does is he's making the gods conform to the reasons that we have about the gods. Do you get the massive change in that? And there's a dialogue called the Euthyphro, in which the question is asked of the primary character of the dialogue by Socrates, and that dialogue occurs in the context of Socrates just about ready to go to court, meeting this character who's also going to court. I won't go into what he's doing there, but I'll just mention this. The question arises, do the gods love something because it's holy, or is something holy because the gods love it? Can you see the distinction? Do the gods love something because it is holy, or is something holy because the gods love it? And if something is holy because the gods love it, that means that the holy, this idea of the holy or the pious, is what dominates, which is another way of saying, if you can use your reason and identify that, then you can distinguish between truly divine things as well as truly heroic things, and those things which aren't really divine and those that are. You can see that's quite advantageous to the human mind. And I'll just contrast this way of seeing, though, again with the Bible, so you get this very other kind of orientation. The book of Job. Is anyone, are you familiar with the book of Job? Okay, it's a magnificent story. And what happens in that story is that God loves Job, and Satan comes along and says, well, of course he loves you, God. You give him all this great stuff. You take it away from him and you'll see if he still loves you. You'll really get the mettle of the man. So a whole lot of plagues, including the death of the wife and kids, comes to, it's not the wife didn't die. Oh, the wife doesn't die. Okay, thank you for correcting me. Okay, but the death of some children. It's a horrible set of circumstances. All the neighbours are talking about Job. They're trying to make sense of it. And ultimately then God appears in the whirlwind, and the essence of what he tells Job is, you don't understand and you can't see what is going on. You haven't fought with Leviathan, you haven't fought with the Behemoth. And that is really emphasizing this very Jewish perspective, biblical perspective, which will also feed into Christendom, that we are very limited in what we can know. The world is just too big. Which is why there was a tradition within the Christian tradition, whereas a number of Christians were open to and ran with philosophy to do theology. There have always been others, and perhaps the most important recent one historically, when I mean relatively recent, is Martin Luther. Martin Luther, when he sparked off the Reformation, he is really aligning himself with far more earlier Christians that were emphasizing the fact we don't know. We cannot know. Now, not knowing is also something Socrates says all the time. But as I mentioned last week, the way Socrates says it is really brings you to a place that you can start looking to know. That is very different from when you're working with as I said, a command culture, and where righteousness is built around doing the will of God. But the will of God is based upon contingency. That is, things that you can't figure out by reason. And here's the thing, and this is very much the kind of thing that the Jews had picked up on. Why would love be something rational? Why would it be rational? Plato actually does try, in 2 dialogues, to provide a rational account of the nature of love. And they're great dialogues. But what is really interesting is when you compare that with the biblical view, you see that they're very different. You see there's all sorts of things that are intrinsic, and especially the whole sacrificial nature of the divine that comes out in Christianity, which is again predicated upon something in the Bible when God says to, or the angel says to Abraham, I'll provide the sacrifice, after Abraham believes he has to sacrifice his son, Isaac, because again, a divine command, which doesn't seem to make any sense. I might return to that story later. Yes?
That one was a test. That was
yeah, well, that's right, it's a test. Okay, it's a test. But from a rational point of view, this idea of a test is completely crazy. That's why a philosopher like Immanuel Kant will say that couldn't have been God that did that. So why does God do these tests? See that, but that then fits into a very different way of putting life together. So I'm not trying to provide an argument against or for here. I'm just saying these are very 2 different ways of seeing things, and there's no real rational motive that a human being can come up with why would God do this, choose this, etc. That's and it's just not that kind of way of doing reality. All of this stuff we'll carry on with. But so what then we're looking for in Plato, He's wanting something definable, because the whole point of the philosophical modus operandi is to find the nature of things so you can define it. You can define it. You can present an argument for it. So the definition is all important. This is what Socrates is always doing. What is courage? Define it. What is virtue? Define it. What is justice? Define it. And he's finding out people can't do it. They confuse themselves. Remember what I said about logic and the law of non-contradiction last week? They contradict themselves. Therefore, their definition is shitty. Now, Socrates, Plato-Socrates, right, is aware that a definition may not always be understood. So there's a kind of openness in this. But nevertheless, the search for definition is ultimately a search for stability. And the stability is at the key of all this. Plato is looking for what he ultimately argues are essences. He uses a term, I did mention this last week, things in themselves. They're the things that do not change. Justice is justice. It cannot change. Holiness is holiness. It cannot change. Mind is mind. It cannot change. The soul is a soul. It cannot change. That is its fundamental nature. These stabilities, and Plato also, in a number of dialogues, this theme recurs. We won't be able to know everything if everything is changing. And there were two great pre-Socratic philosophers, one called Heraclitus and one called Parmenides. And Parmenides argued that nothing changes, that what we perceive as change is really basically a flux around a constant. Heraclitus argued everything is always in flux. Everything is always changing. And Plato says they both got hold of something, but the point is, and this is what's often called Plato's two worlds theory, in this physical world, and I'll come back, I'll go further into the method in a moment, but in this two world theory, in this world, everything is changing. You're getting older, things are coming, going, emerging, disappearing, etc. This is what we see. We can only know them by pinning them down, and the only way to pin them down is to identify what are the essential, unchanging characteristics of anything. Whether it's a human being or anything, we have to be able to do that. Now you can imagine that if what we're looking for is the absolute stable, then the highest thing, the God, cannot be a God if it's not stable, if it's not permanent, if it's not eternal. In fact, eternal in this sense is very Greek. It's a very Greek term. It's eternal in the unchanging sense. Later, Christendom will use this language to describe God, but we start to see there's a very big difference between the biblical God and the scholastic God. The scholastic God, the God that is commonplace in medieval theology within Catholic Christendom. And again, we will see why there's this great contestations go on with Christendom. It has a lot to do with about the nature of what is recognizable as God, and where the stories about that, the definitive stories, may come from, whether they're reasons or whether, again, they're a tradition of the recording of an encounter, which is the stories of the Bible. So, Platonic, if he changes, if he gets angry, if he can be swayed by sacrifice. See, all this, again, when you think of why Socrates has gone to court, strange new God, well, this is a strange new God. Plato presents Socrates as going to make the ritual, making the public sacrifice. But in here, he's telling us Socrates doesn't think that sacrifice matters anything, or the sacrifice, a real God doesn't want to sacrifice. The real God is something intelligible. And ultimately, and we see this really sealed and cemented by Aristotle, the God will become intelligence itself. Intelligence itself will be the God. Intelligence, reason, mind. The Greeks use the word nous, N-O-U-S. As I said, the Oh, now I'll go to book 10. So that's the criticism there. So what he's basically saying is you need to censor these stories, rewrite them. Don't give them that. Don't give them the Odyssey. Don't give them the Iliad. Don't give them those plays. Rewrite the stuff. Make it more philosophical. Well, you can see it wouldn't be very interesting. In fact, everyone would be sitting around reading Plato's dialogues. That would be, and Socrates, and we'll see it at the conclusion of the Republic, does come up with a new kind of poetry, but it's all, you could say, moral poetry. Very much like when you see debates now about changing the stories that people used to read 20 or 30 years ago as sexist, as racist. We shouldn't read that. We should retell the story. That's Platonism. You can see it's exactly the same. You know, very few people that are doing this have an idea that this strategy was tried 2,500 years ago. But it's exactly the same kind of move. And you can see when you're starting to think along a path, which reason is wanting to take you upon, it's very understandable why you might make that move. Whether it's the best move or not is another thing, but it's understandable why you would do it. It makes sense because you've already put yourself in the position of knowing what is right, what is wrong, and how to get your citizens to go from A to B to C to D to E. Now, in Book 10 of the Republic, I'll come back to this. I preceded this. What he says, when he says the poets don't know anything, they lack a method, he's really saying they only get glimpses into things. They only get a glimpse of things. And if we only get a glimpse of things, then we can't really understand it. And we're only getting a glimpse of the surface of things. So a poet is writing about a war. They haven't been to war, but they've heard some stories, so they put that in. They're writing about a general or a hero. They haven't seen the person, but they put together bits and pieces of it. This is passed down to the citizens. They get the bits and pieces, or the community as a whole, they get the bits and pieces of the story. And eventually, says Plato, what this is doing, it's a kind of madness. No one's seeing anything. It really is the blind leading the blind. I've mentioned the different rulers of, so the different hegemons. I'm going to, okay. So before, there's some other features about the philosophical education which will bring me back to the critique of the poets. But first of all, let's just run through. I said to you last week, the Republic is the first great writing in philosophy of education. And I don't know if you guys doing studying education do a subject called philosophy of education, do you?
I don't think so.
Okay, if you did, you get lots of Plato. You get Plato, Rousseau, and John Dewey, and then you get more recent stuff. But Plato was always first rank off because he goes through and he makes the argument that the kind of characteristics that you want to foster in people require that they have a knowledge of music, a knowledge of harmony, astronomy, harmony, gymnastics for the body, and mathematics. What you can see in this is this idea of the harmony of the soul and looking for wherever harmony is possible. Now, just as he had done a critique of the poets, he also does a critique of music, and I always have to smile at this because you think, what, they're playing zithers and pretty, you know, and pipes, and he's going nuts. So you could see what he'd make of death metal or something like this, or rap or something. It would drive him completely bonkers. And there was a very good music critic called Ralph Gleason, who was a jazz critic, but also writing when rock music was starting to break through in the 60s. And he wrote a great piece in which he quotes Plato, and he's saying, Plato would think this is tearing down the walls of the society, but this is exactly what, you know, we're blowing away the past. This music, the Stones and the Who, and this loud music is blowing down, let alone the punks who came later, you know, and then metal and etc. This is all meant to be a sonic assault upon the senses. You're changing the social character by having music. And as I said, well, with Plato, it's all very soft kind of music, relatively. But Plato really goes bonkers about the dangers this can create to the soul. So again, he wants to control that, and you can see this is a kind of education which is both role modeling but also controlling. It's not one in which the inventiveness of free play is getting much license here. He's not interested in that. Whether that's right or wrong is another thing. But it is really about, remember, one person, one task. It's really about if you're going to be a ruler, then you have to be cultivated a certain way. Your soul has to be a certain way. If you're unbalanced, if you lack harmony in your very self, if you're listening to the kind of music that makes you bounce up and down and listening to the poets that make you get excited, you can't do your job right. The other thing he introduces, which I touched upon last week, I just mentioned briefly, is the idea that women could be guardians and hence part of the ruling class. It would be wrong to see this in modern feminist terms, because the whole premise of what is being argued for and the whole purpose of this is a much more, and I'm going to use, even in spite of what he said about sacrifice to the gods, I'm going to use an archaic term to describe the way politics up until modern times had always been considered. And that is, a political order was a sacrificial order. Everybody had certain roles, duties, and obligations. And when we look at Aristotle, we'll see how he really maps this out. But this is also something that deeply concerns Plato. One person, one task, everyone's got to do the right kind of thing. Because women may have intelligence, if it's cultivated, then they can rule. You know, we just want the smartest. And I mentioned last week, Socrates, when in the Dialogue on Love, the symposium, he basically gets a long lecture from Diotima, who's a woman. It's also, for the guardians, is to be the abolition of the family. Nothing too close. In fact, you know, what Plato is basically saying, the philosophers and the guardian class, they're doing it for the good of the whole, not for themselves. That means that neither their family nor property, no private property, should be, or they should not have a family. So that they get together every so often for sexual congress for the purpose of having children. I mentioned this. And philosophers, the best trained, the smartest should be kings. And one of the reasons he said they should be kings is because the philosophers, seeing the way things are, they have no interest in ruling. It's because they don't want to be ruler. They don't have the kind of ambition which drives others. And, you know, he's got a very interesting point here, because authority, political authority in Greece, a major reason for seizing it was that you could seize other people's property along the way of achieving that political authority. Okay, let me go a little bit more into the Platonic method, and what we're searching for is one primary idea, the good life. We want knowledge because we believe it's good. We want truth because we believe it's good. Insofar as goodness is the answer to the ultimate, it's the ultimate answer, it becomes the ultimate idea in Plato. This is what's driving us. We need to devote ourselves to understanding the good. We need to understand what he calls the ideas or forms, the ideas of things. I may have mentioned last week, Plato is the first person to coin the term an idea, an eidos. It is etymologically derived from the word to see. But you're not seeing with your physical eye, you're seeing with your mind's eye. The question is, how do you get to the point where you can see? And justice is an idea, like all things. And ideas, here's the point, if you understand the idea, you can look at the phenomena. You can look at the transitory things, but you've got a stable perspective from which to survey it. Now, there's two great parts in the Republic, one of which is standardly trotted out in philosophy of education textbooks, and the other is really a great key to Plato's method. So the first one is this idea of the cave. and it's called the allegory of the cave. In a sense, they're both allegories. They're attempts to tell you what philosophy and reasoning are like. And Plato or Socrates says, imagine that you're in a cave and you're forced down and you're seated there and you're looking at the wall of the cave, and imagine outside the cave there's the sun and there's a fire above the cave and there's people and carts and animals walking across the entrance, and you can hear the noises, you can hear the voices. But you, because you can only see shadows on the wall, you will think that the shadows are the real thing. You get the point. What we're seeing is not the real thing. They're like shades, they're like shadows. But if a philosopher, or if somebody, could take off the fetters, walk slowly to the entrance, adjust their sight, and then see the people, the fire, and then the sun, they would see the proper order of illumination. And this is analogous to what he sees the philosophers doing. Only the philosopher, and then if they were to go back and say to the other people, hey, they're just shadows on the wall, you don't know what you're seeing, you're being confused. This is what the philosopher and the philosophical perspective for Plato are like and are. The second allegory or analogy is that of the divided line. And he divides it between the world of appearances and the intelligible world. And again, it's the intelligible world that concerns Plato. And he basically says, look, let's divide things in this way. On the one hand, let's take the fact that you see a physical object. And let's say that you don't just see the object first, you see a reflection of that object, say in water. When you look at the water, you've really got a distorted image of what it is. So he's basically saying most people's view of things is like people that are looking at the water. But then you look more closely and you see what the physical thing is. Okay, but that's a physical thing. He says, but then there are other things which are really important, like justice, like goodness, where there's nothing to be seen. And then there's a kind of intermediary form. And he uses geometry as an example of that. So, you know, with geometry, that when you draw, say, a triangle on the board and it's supposed to be 180 degrees, it will never really be, because you're the kind of surface you've got, your drawing ability, etc. But you know that when you're doing geometry, you're just trying to express something in a visible form that's really invisible. And Plato said, well, that is the kind of knowing. And that's a kind of, but the highest kind of knowing, there's no way of providing anything visible. It's simply principle, if you like. It's simply rationality. And when we're talking about the virtues, this is what we're talking about. You know, you can see a picture of Socrates, but someone else could look ugly like him, have spindly little legs, as he was reputed to have big lips and a big nose. You know, the Greeks used to make fun of the fact that Socrates was ugly, and Socrates makes fun of himself in both Xenophon and in Plato. But that's not Socrates. Socrates is the soul. And that you can't see. You have to close your eyes. And how do we get this? Well, you have to deal with hypotheses. And that's really the key to the Platonic method. You come up with a hypothetical definition, and then you examine it. And you examine it by saying, what are the instances, the class of possibilities or realities that fit under that common form? And when you know the common form, then you've understood what you're talking about. Until you've done that, any talk of truth, justice, all of this is just hearsay. Just like the earlier discussion in the Republic, people are just repeating the crap that they've heard, according to Plato, from the poets. They're just repeating stuff. But the philosopher can nail it. The philosopher can nail it through this inquisitive engagement, and through not being satisfied till they reach a proper definition. Now, this is where the ideal city ultimately gets to, and we go more and more into detail of it, but there's a point in which Glaucon, who's got G'd up with this idea of philosophers being kings, is wondering how the hell can they do it? And we've already seen some of the problems, like the baby swapping that went on that I mentioned last week. You know, taking the best ones from the poorer classes or the agrarian class or people in the city, you know, just those doing stuff who aren't guardians, and shifting the dummy babies from the guardian class back there. It's a kind of nightmare world, really. And then there's this attempt to locate, and finally, you know, how can we get it? How can we get it? And finally, him and Glaucon decide, well, basically, you'd have to have a bunch of 10-year-olds because they wouldn't be so corrupted by previous ideas. Well, in a sense, it's Plato is really saying, look, it's not going to happen. It can't happen. He would like it to happen, but it can't happen. And in two other dialogues, which are both on politics, Plato takes very seriously the idea that the philosopher king is the best, but it's undoable. That's the statesman and the laws. But what then Plato does do is he said, but with this idea of justice we've gained from looking at the good city, here we've got a vantage point to judge other regimes. And what he then sees is a connection between the other regimes. And this is really quite brilliant. And he basically sees a degeneration. And for Plato, which might be a surprise to some people, he sees that the closest to democracy is tyranny. And he's got reasons for doing this based upon Greek experience, that often mass politicization, well, mass, you know, the mass of the citizens, not the entire social body, had led to resentment between poor and rich, or it involved resentment between poor and rich, and someone comes to speak on behalf of the poor and the dispossessed, and they end up being a tyrant, even though they've got initial support from the demos, the people. So he sees this, he goes in the Republic to a kind of, if you've got the rule of the best, to the rule of the honourable, to the rule of the rich, to the demos, which he has very savage critique of democracy. He basically sees it as chaotic and people not listening to anybody and just following their own appetites. And he thinks, well, if you really just follow your own appetites, then the one with the biggest capacity to satisfy their appetites will be the strongest person, and that will be the tyrant. And you will recall me saying last week that what Plato is interested in doing is, ultimately there's two kinds of lives, the tyrant or the philosopher. So he's interested in trying to win over those with the largest appetites and get them to see that the best appetites are the philosophical appetite, intelligence itself. In the statesman, Plato also does something that Aristotle will pick up on, and that is he basically divides regimes into two types, and there's 6 of them. One is monarchy, another is tyranny, one is aristocracy, one is oligarchy. Aristocracy, the rule of the best. That's really a traditional concept, the best being those with usually with a better pedigree. The way Plato is using it is those with more knowledge and better behavior. Oligarchy, the rich, or democracy with law and democracy without law. Ultimately, Plato, and Aristotle will follow him, only develop this much further, decides that actually some kind of mixed constitution is going to be the most viable and likely, and be able to draw upon the better regimes. So, why is a philosophical life better? In a sense, this is the question that has been weaving its way through the Republic. It's better because reason will rule the appetites. The tyrant is ultimately a monster, perpetually dissatisfied, creating chaos, disorder, savagery, and unpleasantness all around. And their life will be unpleasant. The tyrant, and remember, homoerotic love was a constant feature of this, and Plato gives examples of tyrants who they're only left with their lover because they've either killed or plundered from and made enemies of pretty well everyone else, and then that lover will want to be tyrant. They will then kill their beloved. So even in love, even in intimacy, nothing is sacred. And Plato sees that tyranny is the affliction of the Greeks, and there was good historical reasons for him saying that, because there had been periodic and numerous tyrannies throughout ancient Greece. And I mentioned last week, I won't go through it again, but in the dialogue on the Gorgias, we see another study of the way in which oratory can be bound up with the pursuit of tyranny. Remember, if you can get people to do your will in the forum, in the assembly, then you can basically get someone ostracized and seize their property. And this kind of thing was happening a lot in ancient Greece. And Plato sees this as a terrible thing. The Republic finally ends with a story. Now, Plato actually says this. He says, this is a logos, not a mythos. And here is the first place where this distinction between the myth and the logos, the rational story, and just the story, is made. But the thing is, it is a kind of fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale that's in service to philosophy. So in this way, it's an example of the kind of thing that Plato believes is necessary if philosophy is to rule. And it's a myth of immortality. So why does he bring up this myth? And the reason is very simple. And it's an old question. It's an ancient question, and the Greeks are by no means the only ones to ask it. In fact, a lot of people ask it. You can find writings in ancient Mesopotamia or Assyria where they are raising this very question. How is it that someone can be good and yet have a terrible life? See, underneath this is the idea that somehow the cosmos should be just. This is a very archaic, primordial sentiment, and I think you scratch people today, they still think like this. I think 99.99% of people, if you put them in the right question, they're really thinking this, even if they don't believe in God or an afterlife. They want. I was just watching. Has anyone seen the Ricky Gervais show Afterlife? Okay, a little bit. Okay. I use this because Ricky is very funny. He's very funny, but he really has a thing about religion, and it drives him to distraction. I personally, I think he's really great, and I think he's really smart. But I think when he talks on this stuff, it's really terrible. I think it's really not very smart, and I think it's not very smart because to discuss religion, you have to talk anthropology, you have to talk history, you have to talk psychology. You can't just do a simple kind of philosophy thing of the sort that Ricky Gervais does. But that's another question. You might think this is great, I love what he does, but you'll never have any understanding of why people were religious, so-called, in the first place, why myth occurred. And in fact, he does try to answer that in a book's a movie, terrible movie, but about something lying is in the title. Well, it's a big god, big man in the sky kind of story that's just trying. Well, that's a very enlightenment. That's a very post-18th century way of looking at this. But I'm just not. Anyway, the reason I've gone into this example rather than going on about Ricky Gervais is in that show. It's really an attempt to tell, it's a guy whose wife has died and he's trying to make sense of it. And he's trying to make sense of his life. And, why should he? And the central story that's coming out of it is, well, you should just try and do good in the world. And the other thing that keeps coming up in the show is that Ricky Gervais and his friends keep telling him he's a good person, which I think someone should have tapped him on the shoulder and said, you want to think very carefully about this. How good is anyone really? How good are you really? Why are you making this claim about yourself? What and exactly? Let's push this further in a Socratic way, and you might be exposed a bit as somewhat vulnerable and not as good as you think you are. But the reason I mention this is here is still someone trying to come with an answer. Why should I be good in a world that's not good? And you go, well, I want to be a good person. Because if you were to say, you will make the world better, will you? You might make it a bit better, but how much better? And you're not the beneficiary of it. See, this is the kind of issue that Plato is wrestling with. And the reason he moves to an idea of immortality is because I think he's more rigorous than someone like Ricky, and recognizing that no matter what good we do, so much ungood out there, that the good will suffer. So why is it better to suffer wrong than do wrong? Now, one way I say it, look, that's all I'm going to do. I think that's a plausible answer. That's it. I've just made that choice. But it's not particularly rational. So if you're criticizing the next move for not being rational, I just say, well, how rational have you been? And that raises the question, how much can reason do anyway? It keeps bringing us against the walls of unknown. And that's exactly what people are always up against, these walls of not knowing and trying to, the fact that we don't know about what the future will bring, but it doesn't stop us acting, so we act anyway. So what Plato is doing in the Republic is he said, well, this is the story we're going to run with. We're going to run with the story that the soul is immortal. So that what you do here, and by immortal he means reincarnation, metempsychosis. And Plato really liked the Egyptians, and this also, some of the Egyptians also thought this, so this was commonplace amongst the Egyptians. So the idea is that your imperfections will be judged, and then you will have to live through what you've done. You have to be punished in order to purify yourself. So this is ultimately a story about the soul's purification. And it comes back to, he wants this story about the soul's purification because he ultimately wants to argue that somehow the cosmos is just. And we as members of the cosmos, if we wish to be just, then we're working in attunement with this underlying principle of intelligence, the justness of intelligence. So harmony all the way through, in spite of the fact that the surface is not harmony, in spite of the fact that discord occurs, in spite of the fact that Socrates, there's tumult. And you can see it's very otherworldly. And the other world is ultimately the world of ideas, and it's finally cemented with this idea of a story of the soul, which he says is not a myth, but a logos, but is, of course, it's a kind of myth. It is a kind of myth. It's an enduring, it's not an uncommon myth. It's not a million miles away from Hindu and Buddhist myths about reincarnation and rebirth. So that is a possibility of the human mind to entertain, and Plato does it. And the rediscovery, by the way, of Plato in the 16th century, some bits haven't got lost, but a whole lot of stuff was rediscovered, including this book, the Republic, which had just disappeared from library shelves and everything. The rediscovery of that went hand in hand with the rediscovery of all these esoteric, as they were called, magic texts, astrological texts, alchemical texts, all these books in which were also interested in the immortality of the soul. And a guy called Marsilio Ficino was translated Plato for one of the Medicis. And in translating this, what you could see in the Renaissance, so-called Renaissance, there was a real interest in magic, alchemy, astrology, and Platonic philosophy. So the Platonic tradition, although it's primarily about reason, what's very interesting is it ultimately feeds into this other tradition in which one has to say it's not that reasonable. You might say it's mystical, but that is one of the fates of Plato. Okay, let's now move to Aristotle. I'm more behind than I hoped. Aristotle, student of Plato. He loves Plato, but in one spot he says, I love Plato, but I love the truth even more. What we see in Aristotle is a certain continuity with Plato, but a certain critique. And I have to say, this is one of the things about philosophy, is that although there can be common commitment to philosophy itself, philosophers almost never agree with each other. Now, in the ancient world, the two greatest philosophical minds are undoubtedly Plato and Aristotle. There's no question of that. It didn't mean, though, in time that they were the most influential. They, after their recovery, yes, they become that. But in the ancient world, other philosophers ended up having far more influence upon the practice of philosophy than Plato and Aristotle. But in terms of quality, there's no question that they are the best. And Aristotle would be a contender for one of the greatest minds that ever existed. In my opinion, it's far more rigorous. It's not as dramatic. It's not as exciting. Aristotle did write dialogues. They all got lost. So we largely have the lectures, his books, but they're thorough, rigorous analyses, and he's much less ready to jump into the heavens than Plato. Though, as we'll see, he ultimately wants to get into the heavens as well. One of the differences between Plato and Aristotle, we recall that the penumbra, the historical penumbra of Plato's writing is the Peloponnesian Wars and the death of Socrates. The penumbra of Aristotle's writing are the Macedonian conquest of the Greeks and then the expansion of Alexander. And Alexander was a student of Aristotle. Aristotle was his tutor, and Alexander even collected species of plants and animals to send back to Aristotle to study. And in this biological, zoological interest of Aristotle is a real key to him. Aristotle is very interested in the study of forms, not so much now in the terms of equating them with ideas the way Plato does, but in another sense. The word morphological, the structure of things. And it really comes out of, I think, or is connected to this biological kind of interest. And as we go further into Aristotle's thought, we see how this is the case. Aristotle himself had been accused of impiety for being a philosopher, and he fled Athens, unlike Socrates. He didn't decide to stay and fight. He was reputed to have said, I would not allow the citizens of Athens to commit the same crime twice against philosophy. Aristotle is a pagan philosopher. He will become the single most important philosophical influence in the Middle Ages, which is one reason why Luther was so hostile to medieval Catholic thinking, because that pagan is driving your thinking. An indication of how important Aristotle was to philosophy can be seen by the fact that the greatest medieval theologian, at least if we discount Augustine, that's a question of nomenclature of where does the Middle Ages begin and where does it end, but the high point of church philosophical thinking, theological thinking, is Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas simply, and Dante, the great poet, follows him on this, simply designates Aristotle as the philosopher. When he talks about Aristotle, he calls him the philosopher. He's the one. Part of the problem, though, of Aristotle's tremendous influences in the Middle Ages, when we get to these four theory of causes, which is brilliant, when we get there, we'll see that there's going to be a problem. And the problem is particularly in the study of physics. And it's precisely because he's coming from biology, so from the higher to the lower. And when you want to understand physics, just laws of motion, Aristotle gets it all wrong. And the basic difference between modern and ancient or medieval natural science, I'm being somewhat simplistic, but this is not wrong, is that the Aristotelian account of the nature of nature goes against the grain of what now is being argued for in the new science. I'll return to this point. It's a very important point, and in some ways we'll look at this in depth. I'm just foreshadowing now. So, whereas Plato was more inspired by mathematics, Aristotle by biology, but also by logic. Aristotle single-handedly, though there's some precursor moves made, I mentioned this last week, by Plato, Socrates, and Parmenides, but what Aristotle does with the science of logic is just extraordinary. as late as the latter part of the 18th century, the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk about much later in the semester, says logic has not changed since Aristotle. Now, that's not really true. There were changes made, but the fact remains here you've got an architect of discipline which was incredibly enduring. It's astonishing. Aristotle is also a tremendous polymath. He studied everything and anything that he could get his hands on. And he was a great systematizer. He tried to bring everything together. Now, note this point, though, about mathematics. So before, we've left Plato behind, but I'll just mention one thing. I had said that Aristotle was seen as a real obstacle to natural science. Interestingly, one of the things that happens, and we can see this with Galileo, is that as Plato's rediscovered, and it's due to a work called the Timaeus of Plato, Plato believed, and he follows the philosopher Pythagoras in this, that nature is written in number. That basically nature, underpinning nature, are laws of number. This is actually going to be a pivotal breakthrough against Aristotle. For Aristotle, that makes no sense. Plato's right, Aristotle's wrong. Thus, Galileo presents a Platonist, or an argument invoking a Platonist, against the Aristotelians in one of his most famous works. Now, we talked about Plato's two-world theory. There's the world of the forms and the world of reality, and in some way, the things of the world participate in the forms, because the forms illuminate it. And Plato and Aristotle wrestles with him on this. Is what do you mean by participate? Now, Plato wrestles with himself in a very complicated and brilliant dialogue called the Parmenides, named after the philosopher Parmenides, written by Plato. Plato is wrestling with this very problem of what and where are the forms given what I've said about them. And Aristotle goes, no, you got it wrong, Plato. Your two-world theory won't work. And there's a famous argument of Aristotle called the third man argument. And it goes like this. You're saying that someone who sees, say, a cup needs to also see the form of a cup to recognize the different cups. But we're now talking about someone who's seeing the cup drawing upon the form, recognizing the cup. So we're occupying another vantage point. And we can keep infinitely doing this, so it's an infinite regress. So if you can do that, you haven't found the stable order that you're looking for. Let's scrap that, says Aristotle. Let's scrap that third man argument. You're caught up in what another philosopher, Hegel, will later use the term bad infinite. It's a bad infinity. You're never going to get to where you want to get, and you're wrestling with it, and it's no good. Forget this idea about it being above reality. Why don't we argue that form is intrinsic to reality? It's intrinsic to reality. Now, this immediately, remember I just said about the natural scientists and Aristotle, this immediately is one of the problems for later natural scientists, because he's saying everything you see has a particular formal dimension to it that's intrinsic to its nature. There's a form of cup, there's a form of coffee holder, coffee pot, a milk carton, of everything you can possibly see. There's some form. It has to, something must conform to its form. Well, again, that's getting, okay, so what you have then is matter is not unified. It's already broken up into the constituent components, which, if you're studying biology, you would say, well, an ant is an ant, a frog is a frog, a bird is a bird. I'm not interested in the line of continuity between ant, frog, and bird. We can see the Darwinian theory is already being ruled out of that straight away, because you've got these infinite, or this plethora of different forms, which is very commonsensical, but it may not help you if you're posing certain other scientific questions. Okay, what this also means then is even concepts like goodness have to be seen in the context of the form. So if you're talking about the goodness of a cup, or the goodness of a pot, or the goodness of a man, or the goodness of a woman, or the goodness of a city, you have to consider their different natures. You can't just be looking for the one thing. It's not helpful. Maybe everything is striving for some good. He actually uses that formulation. But the good for which it's striving will differ according to its nature. So, whereas Plato had used the forms for a stable nature, there is a kind of movement in Aristotle, what he calls entelikeia, that things are moving towards or away from what is good for them. I'll give you an example of this. An eye that is blind. An eye, this is Aristotle, is there for seeing. But if someone loses their sight, they have lost some good capacity. Something of the form of the eye has, in a sense, withdrawn. So there's a lack. There's a lack. And he is arguing we can only judge how things are if we understand the intrinsic goodness, the excellence of what they need to be. And that can only be if all the aspects which make them are functioning well. You can see this is also, see that word function. Aristotle is a philosopher, I said, of morphology, but you can also say of structure and function. And there's certain questions, certain phenomenon that we're better able to understand this way. But there's some other things that may be a great impediment to understanding it. And when, for example, Aristotle writes on the Poetics, so he writes on poetry, very different approach to Plato. He thinks, Plato, what are you doing? You're absolute dill. You know, you want to censor all this, and don't you recognize that what these stories are doing is trying to incite us so we can have empathy for the characters, so we can learn from them? They are morally instructing us. You're quite wrong about this. It's not just simply a role model thing. And then what he does, he starts to analyze the character of tragedy, who was supposed to do something on comedy, but that was lost, apparently, or never done. But anyway, so he breaks it down. It's much closer to looking at the function and the structure. It's much more sympathetic to that. In a sense, and you see this is from a famous painting by Raphael. And that's Plato walking with Aristotle. And Plato is on the right. See the one pointing up to the heavens? And you see the one pointing out like that? That's meant to be Plato goes to the heavens, Aristotle's looking at the things of the world. And ultimately, Plato is saying, this is somewhat simplistic, but this was a large part of the different faiths of Plato and Aristotle, and even theological faiths, is Plato is basically getting you to say, look, the things of the world, they're passing, they're so deficient, we should focus on the heavens. And Aristotle is saying, no. The things of the world, they are a sign of the divine in reality. They're a sign of the goodness in the real. They're not a distraction. They're not a false view. See, that's very different from the cave picture and even the divided line picture. It's much more open to the world. Now, I talked about it being structural, functional, morphological. Aristotle comes up with a theory of four causes. For studying societies, in some ways this was absolutely brilliant. Again, for studying the laws of nature, it's a disaster. So it's called the theory of four causes. So when I say a cause, you're saying, why does something happen? That's the answer to, why did this happen? What caused it to happen? What made it happen? And he says, well, there's always going to be four things. And an adequate answer to your question, why, will have to take into account these four things. First of all, let's say the form. Let me give you an example. Here's a cup, right? In the cup, there's the form of the cup. If the cup didn't have the shape, the characteristic that makes it cup-like in terms of drinking, we'll get to function later, but there has to be a certain form. it has to be made out of certain material. I couldn't make this out of grass, not unless I did something to the grass to harden it or did something like that. But the material and the form have to fit. Matter, form, right? Clear? Good. Then the matter and the form have to come together. They have to be made in such a way, this has to be made in such a way that I can drink from it. And that making is what he calls the efficient cause. In a sense, that's drawing out of the material and making it fit the form, making the material and form fit each other by another causal action. It could be nature that does it, it could be a person that does it, but something else takes this and that makes that. And the first thing is, well, why have you made a cup? Why are cups made? Why are cups made? For drinking. That's the end. That's the purpose of it. So things are done for a purpose. That's the telos, the final cause. And then we could ask that question, why do we drink? Why would the cups are made of drinking? Oh, this is bound up with the survival, and on we go. So when Aristotle is doing this, he is trying to break things down in such a way that we can understand, as I said, structure and function. Logic becomes very important in the whole Aristotelian thing, like Plato, and it will be his influence upon logic in the medieval times that will be so important. And again, people will rebel against that, saying logic is not the answer to our problems. And when we talk about the humanists, I'm just signaling that there will be a very anti-Aristotelian move from these other people who are interested in the study of rhetoric and literature. And again, it's almost like a return of the orators to understanding and exercising power. Aristotle will again be a problem. And finally, I'll just say, with this structuralist functionalist method, which is the key to his understanding of politics, Aristotle studied something like 170 constitutions. The studies have been lost. The Constitution of Athens has been preserved. But you can see that what he's interested in, it's like studying, botany, as I said, studying different species. He's looking at human societies in this same way. When we get to Aristotle, look, I can see people are really fading. I know I'm talking to you a lot. I might just go this last slide, okay? We'll end it on this one, but there's a fair bit in this. This becomes the key to what Aristotle is doing. Ultimately, harmony, hierarchy, and balance is the key to understanding Aristotle. So maybe you could put harmony and balance together, but it's basically seen that there is an ordering, and the ordering is such that you get this kind of harmony. So, first of all, what is the meaning of life? Very philosophical, right? What is the meaning of life? And Aristotle answers, it's the searching of happiness. Now, other philosophers would answer that it's a search for happiness. But you can see there's going to be a problem with that straight away, and Aristotle's not unaware of the nature of the problem. Well, look where it got Socrates. He got executed. Look where it's got me. And then he goes, but by happiness, I don't just mean what he calls bovine pleasures, like a cow eating grass. A person who simply goes around scratching themselves to ease the pain, or simply pursues, women and drink and has a frivolous life. Aristotle says that's not a very happy life. I'm not sure the people engaged in another thought of life may think it's not happy, but he would say, look, you wait and see, and when it all goes and disappears, and as you age, you'll see that that's not a happy life. You've just, wasted your life. You've pissed it up against the wall. No, he says a happy life is the one in which your capacities are fulfilled, and your highest capacity is your mind. So the happiest life, not everyone has a great deal of mind, he says. I recognize that. People have different abilities and different, but the best you could do is to work upon the best part of yourself, and the best part of yourself is the mind, because that discloses to you the proper order of things and your place within the order of things. See the reasoning? Order of things and your place within the order of things. In this respect, contemplation is its own end. And we do things for an end. When I drink, I do it to sustain my thirst. When I eat, I do it to survive, etc., or I do it to get strong. Or when I go to the gym, I do it for this reason or other. But he said to contemplate. This is not, you don't just contemplate to do other things. Now, a lot of people do contemplate to do other things. They read for other things. But he said, no, that's a secondary. That's secondary. Real contemplation is just a meditation upon the order of things and your place within the order of things. It's an appreciation of the magnificence of what that order is. It's a kind of vision of the harmony and balance within the cosmos. And that's also why if in Plato there's a mystical dimension, there's also a neo-Aristotelian or an Aristotelian dimension that's quite mystical. And often people aren't that aware of that because Aristotle is very meat and potatoes kind of philosopher a lot of the time. Very practical. Very, examining the mutai. But at the end of it, this what he's saying about contemplation, it is for a kind of magnificence. Now, he compares this to the practical life. The practical life is also always for something. For justice, or for order, or for survival, or something like that. But contemplation for itself. And the highest thing he calls the mind itself. And this is where, remember what I said about God being intelligence? For Aristotle, the first cause of everything has to be something uncaused. And the only thing that he says that can be uncaused is God. Now, God is what he calls the unmoved mover. It is the intelligence that puts everything at work, or puts motion in the universe, design into the universe. Now note this idea of the world as design. This is, again, I think of Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais thinks that's a biblical idea. A lot of people think that. Well, it's not really. That's not right. Because the idea of design in this kind of sense, the idea of an inner structure, which is the divinity, that's not biblical at all. The biblical God, again, God walks with Adam and Eve. God is person-like. And we are God-like in that we are person-like. This is the opposite. We are God-like insofar as we divest everything of our person except intelligence and realize that intelligence as such is the highest thing. The rest, whereas, again, I'll give another example. In the Bible, you could say everything we say about God is metaphorical, which doesn't mean it's not real, but it's expressed in a metaphorical way. So to speak of the finger of God or the mind of God, equally one. The mind of God is not the highest bit of God in the Bible. In fact, the idea of the mind is not really a Jewish concept. Mind and heart is much more physiologically connected, whereas this is disconnected from body. This is mind qua mind, not brain, mind, intelligence qua intelligence. And this is what Aristotle is looking for. So when people, and there are some philosophers who, if you know anything about, if you read history and go back to these books and look at them seriously, you will just know this. I'm not saying that certain people who read the Bible aren't arguing that there's a design theory in there, but I'm saying that's not really. What they're saying is this is an order, this is an instruction, and this is meant to be taken literally. Well, there's a lot of people that would also argue that the whole point about, or the whole nature of the way in which the Israelites communicated is through stories. And as stories, the idea of fact and non-fact are so blurred that you can't really see what the Israelites are doing as a scientific attempt about anything. It's a sense about the meaning of something, as opposed to this is an attempt to find the inner structure of things. That's why, again, in the Israelite tradition, you don't find scientists or philosophers in the Jewish Bible, the old or Christian Old Testament. It's another mindset. It's dealing with other priorities and other problems. Whereas this kind of scientific mindedness, for better and for worse, or for what it is, it's very Greek. Again, it's concerned with understanding what you see through breaking up the structure or finding the principles which govern it. So this idea of design, as I said, some philosophers are very aware. This is Aristotle. That's Aristotle. It's not biblical. I just emphasize this because I'm kind of bemused by the fact that books of such historical importance are so often bowdlerized, and people make up stuff about tradition. They get completely lost about history. And one of the reasons why it's worth understanding history is to get a better sense of the different drives and directions and kinds of orientation people have had in the past. So we might also espy what we're doing from a perspective that's not our own, because we don't see ourselves well. And we've got no idea how even those that think we're the most virtuous today may be very well hated 200 years down the track. Just as there's all this animosity from the Enlightenment thinkers to all these other people that were much beloved. The animosity towards Jesus and Muhammad and Moses, which is exhibited in some texts in the Enlightenment period, are kind of staggering and would have surprised everyone who follows these either prophets or savior in the Christian tradition. So, Aristotle, intelligence. He believes that the value of political science is the master science because it's responsible for contemplating and helping create a constitution and civic body. He believes that the way we will get this is through identifying excellence, virtue, what we mentioned before. At the core of this attempt to get harmony is a doctrine about harmony, what he calls the mean. And so we always should be searching for the intrinsic balance of things, says Aristotle. Just not too much, nothing in excess. This idea also had a long Greek pedigree. So he didn't invent this. And it's very similar to stuff we find in Plato. But he also says this balance, this mean, our excellence, even this highest objective to contemplate the unmoved mover, we can only do this in a political community. We are communal beings. We're political animals. That's what Plato, Aristotle is the first person to formulate this. We're political creatures, political beings, communal creatures. So when we think about behavior, we have to understand this communally, not just individually. Has to be, and the community, in fact, you've got this concentric circles. And the way in which intelligence is being seen is circle-like. And this will have a very long pedigree in the history of philosophy. Even into the 19th century, the great German philosopher Hegel will conclude his great work on the encyclopedia with this very long quote from Aristotle about intelligence contemplating itself as being sphere-like. Reason is sphere-like. It's untouched, in a sense. It's untouched by the things of the world. It informs in Aristotle the things of the world, but it's untouched by it. And so to have the highest activity, or to put it another way, you never would have had philosophy if you didn't have a community, if you didn't have a political order, which is, that's undeniable. I think that's absolutely undeniable. Okay, no, just briefly on the other side. I'll mention this now, we'll go into it, but in dealing with this forms the basis of two of Aristotle's books, the Ethics and the Politics. Now I want you to notice something here. You're all familiar with the term ethics, right? The code of behavior that you should live by, or we should be ethical, or lots of lots of people who teach literature and the arts telling you all about ethics and how ethical you should be, and this is a great thing, and maybe. A lot of philosophers, ethics is commonplace if you study philosophy. You know, if you study philosophy as a discipline, you'll quickly come across the fact you're in an ethics class, right? And you might ask yourself, am I here because I don't know what's right and wrong? And if I get philosophy, will that help me better see what's right and wrong? And most philosophers absolutely think that's the whole point of doing ethics. Now, I'm not sure. Do I need to go to a course on walking, to walk or to speak? Maybe it could help me. Maybe it could help me in some way. So that's the best. That's a kind of argument that could be said about it. But what you will quickly find, and this is always what happens with philosophy. It's why, you know, I write on philosophy. My last book was a book on philosophy. Philosophers hate my work. They don't hate it. It's just ignored. Because I'm not in the team. You see, I go and I ask a bunch of questions that are partly sociological, partly historical, and they start ripping away at the nice symmetry of philosophy. But to be fair to me, one of the reasons I do it is philosophers rip themselves apart. You get 4 people that teach ethics in a room, they're not going to agree about what ethics is. They certainly won't agree about what the best philosophy of ethics is. And they might say, oh, I believe in this because of this, this, and this, and the other. Ah, yeah, but there's this. It's endless dispute. Now, the reason I mention this is, unlike them, although it's often taught this way, Aristotle's ethics isn't really written because he thinks people don't know what they're doing. And he's there to instruct them. Or even to provide an ethical philosophy in itself. The reason he writes the ethics is because he is writing a guidebook of the kind of behavior you need to be involved in political life. Now that's a very different thing. So he's not interested in the good man as such. He's interested in the kind of behaviors you need to develop and the way of inquiring about those behaviors and talking about them to be more serviceable to a certain kind of constitution. So the ethics and the politics are really closely bound up with each other. Now, of course, he wants a better rather than a worse constitution, but he does recognize that some constitutions, some civic bodies, the problems are so great, to give them the best is silly. It's no use them reading Plato's Republic and trying to get something like it, because there won't be anything near it. The best they may hope for is a better understanding of what there is and what could be a bit better. It's very comparative. This is a very comparative method, and I'll come back to the ethics then. The ethics has to be understood in terms of an understanding of behavior as comparative, and ultimately different roles that people have in relationship to a certain kind of political order. So it's not start a blank book, let me design in my head how human beings should act, which is how lots of ethics, philosophical ethics, goes about doing its business. Okay, we're going to leave it here. Are there any questions? I can talk a little bit more about the mean and all of that, but you can actually see it there if you look more closely at the slide. Sorry. No questions? Okay, I will see you all next week. Cheers.